Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today by having you just think about your news feed for a second.
Oh boy, that's a dangerous place to start.
Right. Or your timeline on X or whatever we're calling it this week. If you follow, any tech billionaires or just anyone who loves the future, you see it literally everywhere.
Rockets.
The rockets. Exactly. The glossy, super artistic renderings of these massive glass domes on Mars.
Yeah, with the little hydroponic gardens that look like they belong in some high-end luxury mall.
Yes, it really is it's this whole aesthetic now. We are living in the era of the Mars dream. And the narrative being pushed is very specific, right? It's all about becoming a multiplanetary species.
It's the new manifest destiny.
Right. It's pitched as this insurance policy for humanity. And look, let's be honest, it just looks incredibly cool. But I was looking at one of these renderings the other day. You know the ones, the happy colonists in their sleek jumpsuits looking out at the red horizon?
Staring dramatically into the Martian sunset.
Exactly. And a thought just hit me.
Which was,
Is that person in the jumpsuit actually, okay, like physically, we know the rocket launch part is dangerous. We've all seen the explosions on YouTube. But once they actually get there, once the main engine turns off and they are just floating in the void for months, or eventually walking around on that rusty dust, are they actually safe?
that is the billion-dollar question. And usually, when we ask if something in space is safe, we are entirely focused on the hardware. We're thinking, will the engine explode? Will the heat shield melt during re-entry?
Will the parachute actually open? The mechanical stuff?
Precisely. But the reality of space travel, and specifically long-duration travel to a place like Mars, is that the environment itself is actively trying to kill the biological organism inside the tin can.
The human animal.
Right. It's not just about the vehicle anymore. It's about the passenger.
So today, for this deep dive, we are going to strip away the glossy renderings. We aren't talking about the rockets today, or the fuel efficiency, or the orbital mechanics. We are asking a much more grounded question. Is space travel safe for you? For your body?
And to answer that, we've pulled together a really massive stack of research. We've got data covering 60 years of actual human flight history. We've got NASA technical reports on human rating requirements, and some, frankly, terrifying medical studies on what happens to your cells and your DNA when you leave Earth.
Right. Our mission today is to drill down from the macro risks, the explosions, all the way down to the micro risks. And just to frame this right out of the gate, NASA actually has an official acronym for the specific dangers we're facing out there.
They do. They call it RIDGI.
RIDGI. Okay. I assume that doesn't stand for really interesting day going east.
Not quite. It stands for the 5 big threats. So you have space radiation, isolation and confinement, distance from Earth, gravity fields, and hostile or closed environments. RIDGI.
The 5 horsemen of the cosmic apocalypse, essentially.
Essentially, yeah. And we're going to go through them. But I think we really need to start with the baseline.
Yeah.
You asked if it's safe. Let's look at the hard numbers first.
Yeah, let's do the back of the napkin math. Because if I bought a ticket on a commercial flight to space tomorrow, or if I somehow signed up for a government mission, what are my actual odds of dying?
Well, safe is a highly relative term. To understand the odds, we have to look backward at the history. There's this comprehensive study by Schmitz and colleagues published back in 2022 that did a complete deep dive into the entire history of manned spaceflight.
Covering what era?
From the very beginning, 1961, all the way up to 2020.
Wow. Okay, so that covers literally everything. Gagarin, all the way through the shuttle and up to the modern SpaceX era.
Exactly. And in that 60-year window, humanity launched a total of 327 manned flights, and we sent up 12,294 astronauts.
Okay, well, 194 people have gone up. And how many didn't come back?
19.
Just hearing that number out loud, 19 fatalities in 60 years, that actually sounds incredibly low to me. I feel like more people die in bathtub accidents in a single year.
That is completely true. From a raw numbers perspective, 19 is a small number of humans. But you have to look at the rate. You have to look at the percentages. If you take those exact numbers, the statistical fatality rate is about 5.8% deaths per space flight historically. Or if you look at it by individual, roughly 1.5% of all astronauts who've ever flown have died during their mission.
1.5%. Okay, yeah, that changes the perspective quite a bit. Because if I told you there was a 1.5% chance your car would just explode on the way to the grocery store today, you definitely wouldn't go.
You would stay home.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To put it in real perspective, the Schmitz study compares it to other activities we consider dangerous. We often think of riding a motorcycle as a high-risk activity, right?
Yeah, ER doctors literally call them donor cycles.
Well, statistically speaking, Going to space is about 8.4 times more dangerous than riding a motorcycle.
Wow. Okay. That paints a picture.
And if you compare it to commercial air travel, like just getting on a normal Boeing or Airbus flight,
Right.
spaceflight is 1,300 times more
So
dangerous.
1,300 times. That's a lot.
So while we haven't lost a huge raw number of people, the inherent risk per event is still astronomical compared to anything else human beings do on a regular basis. However, there is a silver lining in this data.
Please tell me there's a silver lining. I need some good news here.
The overall trend is moving heavily in the right direction. If you look at the 1960s, the fatality rate was terrifying. It was 0.013 deaths per day in space.
Yeah.
Really was the Wild West of engineering. But if you look at the 1990s, and then specifically the period from 2010 to 2020 that's covered in this data set,
Yeah.
there were 0 astronaut deaths during spaceflight.
0. In a whole decade.
During the actual flight phase itself, yes, 0. We have gotten so much better at the getting there part. And the data attributes a lot of this to international cooperation. The International Space Station completely changed the game.
How so?
We stopped treating space like a frantic race to plant a flag, and we started treating it like a permanent laboratory. We built standardization, rigorous safety protocols, massive redundancy, all of that compounded over time to drop the fatality rate.
So, statistically speaking, we've kind of solved the crashing problem.
I wouldn't say solved, we've minimized it, but we definitely haven't eliminated it. And the crucial thing to understand is that the risk isn't evenly spread out over a mission. You aren't in mortal danger every single second you're up there. There are very specific kill zones in a mission profile.
Let me guess. The big fire parts.
The big fire parts. Launch and landing. The data breaks down all the incidents by phase. Launch has seen 12 major incidents and 1 catastrophic accident, which was the Challenger. Landing has seen 9 incidents and 2 accidents.
Wait, landing is just as bad as launching. I always thought getting up there was the hard part.
In some ways, landing is actually worse. Just think about the physics involved. During launch, yes, you were sitting on top of a controlled chemical explosion. You were fighting the entire gravity well of the Earth to get away, but you were gaining energy.
Right.
But during landing, you're hitting the upper atmosphere at 17,000 miles per hour. You have to bleed off all of that insane kinetic energy without burning up, and then you still have to deploy a chute and stick the landing.
It's all about the transition points, going from 0 to Mach 25 on the way up, and then having to come all the way back down to 0 without dying.
Precisely. Once you are actually stabilized in orbit, the risk of a catastrophic mechanical failure, something that results in immediate loss of life, drops off a cliff. The data shows 10 incidents in orbit over the years, sure, but they are almost always manageable. The launch and the landing are where you have absolutely 0 margin for error.
I think we need to talk about that phrase, margin for error, because when we say accident or incident while looking at a spreadsheet, it sounds very sterile. It sounds like someone filling out an insurance claim form. But in spaceflight, an accident is, well, it's incredibly visceral.
It is. It's violent. And I think to really respect the danger of what we're trying to do with Mars, we have to look at the history of what happens when the margin of error vanishes. The reports we're looking at detail 2 historical accidents that perfectly highlight the hostile environment aspect of that RDGE acronym. Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11.
I know a little bit about Soyuz 1. That was the Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, right?
Yes, 1967. This story, it really is one of the most tragic and at the same time heroic moments in spaceflight history. And it is the ultimate textbook illustration of mechanical failure.
Walk me through what happened.
Pretty much everything. From the very moment he reached orbit, the ship was failing. It was a brand new spacecraft, rushed into service. Immediately, one of the 2 solar panels failed to deploy.
So he's flying on half power right away.
Less than half, actually, because the physical imbalance of having only one panel out made the ship incredibly hard to orient towards the sun. So his batteries are just draining fast. Then the attitude control sensors failed. The ship started tumbling. He completely lost automated stabilization.
I can't even imagine the psychological terror of that. You're completely alone, it's freezing dark outside, your ship is dying around you, and you're just physically spinning in a void.
And he knew exactly how much trouble he was in. Ground control knew it too. They scrambled, aborted the entire mission plan, and ordered an emergency reentry. But because the automated systems were dead, the automatic orientation system failed too.
So the ship doesn't know which way is down.
Right. So Komarov, while the ship is tumbling, while he's running out of electrical power, had to calculate and execute a manual reentry procedure that had never been fully tested.
That sounds literally impossible.
It really should have been. But he was arguably one of the best test pilots the Soviet Union ever produced. And he actually did it. He flew the manual procedure flawlessly. He lined up the ship perfectly. He fired the retro rockets at the exact right fraction of a second. He survived the intense heat of the reentry burn. He made it all the way through the atmosphere.
Wow. So he survived the hard part? He beat the physics?
He survived the pilot part. He did everything a human being could possibly do.
Yeah.
But then came the mechanical part. He's falling through the sky. He deploys the main parachute. And the mechanism fails. It didn't pull out of the container. It just jammed.
Oh, no.
So he's in free fall. He pulls the manual release for the backup reserve chute. The reserve chute deploys, but because the smaller drogue chute was still trailing behind him and the capsule was tumbling violently in the air,
The line's tangled.
the reserve chute wrapped itself around the drogue chute lines. It never inflated.
So he had nothing to slow him down.
He hit the ground at 90 miles per hour. And the solid fuel retro rockets, which are designed to fire just a few feet before touching down to soften the final impact, they fired right on impact. That ignited the remaining fuel. By the time the recovery team got to the site, the capsule was completely consumed by fire.
God, that is just, it's heartbreaking. He did absolutely everything right. He fought so hard to live.
He did. And that is the harsh lesson of Soyuz 1. You can be the perfect astronaut. You can have the perfect training, the perfect reflexes. But if a simple mechanical parachute release jams, gravity wins. Every single time. That's the brute force macro-level risk of spaceflight.
So that's the mechanical failure side of things. What about Soyuz 11? You mentioned that one was fundamentally different.
Soyuz 11 was 4 years later, in 1971. And this one is terrifying in a completely different way because it was completely silent. This was the crew that successfully visited the first ever space station, Soyuz 1.
Oh, so this was a triumphant mission.
It was a massive historical success. 3 cosmonauts, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev. They spent weeks up there breaking records. They were coming home as absolute heroes.
So the hard work was over.
The mission was done. They detached from the station. They did the reentry burn. The descent was textbook. The capsule touched down softly in the steppes of Kazakhstan. It looked perfect. The recovery team landed. They ran up to the capsule, knocked on the side to congratulate them. No answer. So they opened the hatch and they found all 3 men completely dead in their seats.
Just like that. But there was no crash, no fire.
No fire. The ship was intact. The reports say they almost looked like they were just asleep.
What on earth happened to them?
Well, it didn't happen on Earth. It happened just after they left orbit. There was this small pressure equalization valve, a tiny mechanical valve about the size of a coin. It's designed to open automatically when the capsule gets close to the ground, deep in the atmosphere, to let fresh air into the cabin so the internal pressure matches the outside.
Right, like so your ears don't pop, but on a critical life support level.
Exactly. But this specific valve was accidentally jerked open by the physical shock of the explosive bolts that separate the different modules of the spacecraft while they were preparing for re-entry. And this happened while they were still in the vacuum of space, over 100 miles out.
So they vented their entire oxygen supply into the vacuum?
Rapid depressurization. The entire cabin went from 1 normal atmosphere pressure to absolute 0 in seconds.
Could they do anything? Could they plug it?
The telemetry and the physical evidence inside showed they desperately tried. Patsayev actually unbuckled from his seat and tried to manually reach the valve to crank it closed. But you have to understand, in a total vacuum, you only have seconds of useful consciousness.
How many seconds?
Maybe 15 to 30 seconds before the oxygen is literally pulled out of your bloodstream and you black out. Then death follows very quickly from asphyxiation and the physical effects of decompression.
And they weren't wearing pressure suits.
At that time, no. Because of space constraints in the capsule, they flew in standard flight suits. After Soyuz 11, pressure suits became mandatory for launch and re-entry. But it highlights the pure closed environment risk. The only thing keeping you alive in space is that incredibly thin metal shell. If the shell breaches, biology just stops.
Wow.
And that leads us perfectly into the next layer of danger. We've talked about these internal failures, the valves, the parachutes, the things we build breaking. But we also have to talk about what is waiting outside the shell, because space is not empty.
No, it's full of junk.
It is, a massive amount of it. In aerospace, we call it MMOD, micrometeoroids and orbital debris.
You know, I feel like every single sci-fi movie set in space has that mandatory scene where the ship gets absolutely shredded by a cloud of debris, like in Gravity. Is it really that dramatic in real life?
It's what we call a directional risk. The NASA report describes it a bit like driving your car through a thick bug swarm on a highway.
The front windshield takes all the hits.
Right, the forward-facing side of a spacecraft takes the brunt of the impacts. But in orbit, the bugs aren't insects. They are tiny flecks of paint from old rockets or stray screw bolts, and they're moving at 17,000 miles per hour.
So a literal paint fleck hits you like a bullet.
It hits with the kinetic energy of a high-caliber bullet, yes. Because energy equals mass times velocity squared. The mass is tiny, but the velocity is astronomical. A paint fleck can deeply crack heavily reinforced windows. A tiny screw can completely puncture a thermal radiator. And the real problem we are facing now is orbital congestion.
Because we are launching so much stuff.
Exactly. We're launching thousands of commercial satellites, Starlink, OneWeb, military assets. The more stuff we put up into low Earth orbit, the higher the statistical risk of collisions.
Which creates more debris. It's a feedback loop.
The Kessler syndrome. It's a theoretical cascade of debris where one collision creates 1,000 fragments which hit other satellites, creating 10,000 fragments, until the entire orbit becomes an impassable cloud of shrapnel. It could literally threaten all future mission safety.
Could trap us on Earth.
It could. But honestly, when you talk to mission planners for Mars, debris is viewed as a manageable risk. We have radar to track the big pieces and maneuver around them. We can build physical Whipple shields to absorb the small pieces. There is, however, an invisible enemy out there that is much, much harder to deal with than physical debris.
Let me guess. Radiation.
Radiation. NASA officially identifies this as the single greatest technological and biological obstacle for deep space travel, for getting to Mars or building a colony on the moon. And notice I emphasize deep space.
What's the major distinction there? The ISS is in space. Those astronauts are floating around. Aren't they getting blasted by radiation?
They are getting a higher dose than we are on the ground, but they are still fundamentally protected. The Earth has a massive magnetic field, the magnetosphere. It acts like a giant, invisible umbrella over the planet. The International Space Station actually flies under that umbrella. It's tucked in safe. So it's protected from the absolute worst of the cosmic weather. But if we fire engines for Mars, or even just transit back to the moon, we're actively stepping out from under that umbrella.
We are swimming out of the shark cage.
We are swimming out of the cage into the deep ocean. And there are 3 distinct types of radiation sharks waiting for us. First, you have the trapped radiation.
The Van Allen belts, right?
Right. It's a literal donut-shaped band of intense trapped radiation surrounding the Earth. You don't want to hang out there, but you have to fly through it quickly to leave the neighborhood. Then second, you have SPEs, solar particle events.
Solar flares, when the sun acts up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every so often, the sun basically burps out a massive, highly energized cloud of protons. If a spacecraft is caught in the path of one of these without adequate shelter, the crew can absorb a fatal dose of radiation in a matter of minutes. It causes acute radiation sickness, extreme vomiting, internal burns, rapid organ failure.
But we can at least see those coming, right? We have all those solar observatories watching the sun 24/7.
We do. We can forecast space weather to some degree, and the mitigation strategy is relatively straightforward. You build a small storm shelter deep inside the ship, you surround a tiny closet with your drinking water tanks, and when the alarm sounds, the crew huddles in there for a day or two until the storm passes. They'd probably be fine.
Okay, so that's 2 sharks down. What's the third one?
The third one is the monster,
Yep.
GCRs, galactic cosmic rays.
You know, that sounds exactly like a weapon a comic book villain would use.
It's significantly worse than a comic book weapon.
Yeah.
These are high-energy atomic nuclei. I want you to imagine an iron atom. It's heavy, it's dense. Now imagine it has been completely stripped of all its electrons, so it's just this heavy core. And it is moving at nearly the speed of light.
Okay.
It's not a wave of energy like an X-ray. It's a physical cannonball. And these things don't come from our sun. They come from entirely outside our solar system, from exploding supernovas, from distant black holes, and they are raining down constantly from every possible direction all the time. There is no weather forecast for GCRs. It's just a constant barrage.
Okay, so if deep space is just absolutely full of these invisible microscopic cannonballs, the solution seems fairly obvious to me. We just do exactly what we do on Earth when we deal with X-rays or nuclear material. We build a vault, you line the hull of the Mars ship with lead, you make the walls 3 feet thick, and you just hide inside. Problem solved, right? We have heavy metals.
You would think so. That is the perfectly intuitive, logical answer. Human history tells us that mass equals safety. If you want to stop an arrow, you use a thick wooden shield. If you want to stop a bullet, you use a heavy steel plate.
Right. Just put a big rock between you and the danger.
But in the realm of deep space quantum physics, your intuition is actually your worst enemy. If you wrap a Mars transit vehicle in thick lead, you aren't actually protecting the true at all. You are essentially building a giant microwave, putting your astronauts inside and turning it on. You might obviously kill them much faster than if they had no shielding at all.
Wait, stop. You're saying if I hide behind a giant thick wall of lead, I am in more danger. That makes absolutely zero sense. Lead blocks radiation. That's literally its job. I wear a lead apron at the dentist.
It blocks some types of relatively low-energy radiation, like dental X-rays. But GCRs are fundamentally different beasts. This phenomenon is what physicists call the shielding paradox.
Okay, you have to walk me through this carefully. How does a massive metal shield become a weapon?
It all has to do with the sheer kinetic energy of the incoming particle. When one of these near-light-speed iron nuclei hits a heavy lead atom in your thick shield, it doesn't just get absorbed and stop. It smashes violently into the nucleus of the lead atom.
So it breaks the shield.
It shatters the actual atom of the shield. The source material uses this truly fantastic analogy to explain it. Imagine you are standing on the side of a highway. Someone throws a child's plastic tricycle directly into the grill of a semi-truck that is moving at 70 miles per hour. Does the tricycle stop the truck?
No, obviously not. The truck completely obliterates the tricycle and keeps going.
Exactly. In this scenario, the GCR cannonball is the semi-truck. The heavy lead atom in your shield is the tricycle. The heavy particle obliterates the lead atom and just keeps going. But now, because of that violent impact, you also have all the pieces of the obliterated tricycle, the shrapnel, flying outward in the same direction at bullet speeds.
Oh.
In physics, we call this secondary radiation. Specifically, it generates a shower of neutrons.
So the thick lead wall basically takes one big bullet from space and turns it into a massive shotgun blast inside the cabin.
Precisely. You take a directional beam, which might just pass right through a human body without hitting anything vital if you're lucky, and you purposefully smash it against a heavy metal. That interaction creates a dense cloud of neutron radiation that floods the interior of the ship. And neutrons tear through soft human tissue and DNA even better than the original particle did. So the thick walls approach actually massively amplifies the radiation dose the crew receives.
That is deeply terrifying. It's like a cosmic trap. You try your hardest to defend yourself using Earth logic, and the defense itself is what kills you.
It is a massive engineering headache.
Yeah.
It's the primary reason we aren't on Mars right now. We'll talk about how we're trying to solve it later. Spoiler alert, it involves hydrogen. But just understand that right now, radiation is the massive wall we have to climb over.
Okay, so for the sake of the narrative, let's assume we survive the launch explosion. We survive the vacuum of space trying to suck our air out. We somehow magically dodge the radiation shotgun. We are on the ship, the engines are off, and we are just coasting to Mars. It's a 6 to 9 month trip. I'm just floating there in the cabin. I'm safe now, right? It's just a long camping trip.
You might feel completely safe. You're floating around, doing flips, eating snacks out of the air. It looks fun on camera. But inside your body, a completely biological, chaotic event is taking place from day one. This brings us to the core physiology section of the deep dive. The human body in continuous microgravity.
I know a little bit about the bone loss stuff, the whole use it or lose it thing.
That's a huge part of it, yes.
Yeah.
But let's start with something much more immediate that happens the second you reach orbit. The fluid shift.
The fluid shift, what does that actually mean?
Think about how gravity works on Earth. It is constantly, relentlessly pulling all the fluids in your body, your blood, your lymph, down towards your feet. To counteract this, your body has evolved incredibly strong pumps. The muscles in your legs, the valves in your vascular system, they all work constantly to push that heavy blood back up against gravity to your heart and your brain.
Right, because otherwise all our blood would pool in our ankles and we'd pass out.
Exactly. Now, strap yourself to a rocket and go to space. You turn off gravity, that downward pull is instantly gone. But your body doesn't know that. It doesn't have an off switch for evolution. The biological pumps in your legs just keep aggressively pumping fluid upward.
So all the fluid in your body suddenly rushes up to your head.
Roughly 2 full liters of fluid physically shifts from your lower extremities up into your chest and your head.
Wow. I'm trying to picture how that actually feels. Does it feel like, you know, when you're a kid and you hang upside down on the monkey bars for a long time?
That is the exact sensation nearly every astronaut describes. You know, that intense pressure, the blood violently rushing to your face, your neck veins physically popping out.
Yeah, I can only do that for about 30 seconds before I feel like my head is literally going to explode.
Now imagine feeling that exact sensation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 9 straight months on the way to Mars.
Oof. That sounds absolutely miserable.
It is deeply uncomfortable, and it drastically changes how you look. NASA officially calls it moon face. Your face gets extremely puffy, your eyes get swollen and squinty. You look like you're having a severe allergic reaction to something, And at the same time, your legs get incredibly skinny. They actually call them bird legs because all the fluid volume has completely left them.
So much for looking cool in the spacesuit for the Instagram photos.
Definitely not a flattering look. And there's a side effect to this fluid shift that drives astronauts absolutely crazy. Severe congestion.
Like a cold.
All that extra fluid swells the delicate tissues inside your nasal cavity and your sinuses. You permanently feel like you have the worst, most stubborn head cold of your entire life.
Can you just take a Sudafed or a decongestant? They have a medical kit, right?
They do, but it doesn't really help because it's not mucus causing the blockage. It's literal tissue swelling from blood volume distribution.
Yeah.
And because your nose is completely stuffed up, you lose your sense of smell. And because human smell makes up about 80% of what we perceive as taste.
Oh, man. The food tastes like cardboard.
Exactly like cardboard. That's why if you watch videos from the ISS, you see astronauts putting massive amounts of hot sauce on literally everything. A huge favorite up there is shrimp cocktail, packed with an ungodly amount of raw horseradish. They are just desperate for any kind of sharp physical sensation to cut through the numbness so they can taste their dinner.
Okay, so I'm incredibly puffy, I have a massive permanent headache, and I can't even enjoy my freeze-dried ice cream. But ultimately, that just sounds like extreme discomfort. Is it actually dangerous?
Yes, it can be highly dangerous. This sustained fluid pressure leads to a medical condition NASA is currently very worried about. It's called SANS, Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome.
SANS. That sounds expensive to treat.
It's highly concerning. The fluid pressure inside your skull continuously builds up. And since the skull is rigid, that pressure has nowhere to go, so it starts pushing outward against the back of your eyeballs. It physically flattens the globe of the eye.
Wait, it literally squishes your eyeball out of shape?
It changes the physical geometry of the eye. It causes what doctors call optic disc edema, severe swelling of the optic nerve where it connects to the eye. We have highly trained pilot astronauts who go up with perfect 20/20 vision, and they come back to Earth needing prescription glasses to drive. We're still actively studying if this damage is permanent, but it perfectly highlights how delicate the human machine is when you remove a constant like gravity.
And then there are the bones. We briefly mentioned the use it or lose it rule.
Right? Spaceflight osteopenia. Your body is a ruthlessly efficient machine. If it senses over a period of weeks that you aren't carrying any weight because you're floating, it immediately stops expending precious energy to maintain dense bone mass. Why build up a thick skeleton if you don't need to stand up?
So it just stops repairing the microfractures?
It's much worse than just stopping repair. It actively dismantles your bones. Osteoclastic activity, those are the specific cells that break down and dissolve bone tissue, drastically increases. Meanwhile, osteoblastic activity, the cells that build bone, slows way down. Your body literally starts dissolving your own skeleton and dumping all that excess calcium straight into your bloodstream.
So you are basically peeing out your own skeleton.
Literally.
Oh.
That is exactly what is happening. And where does all that excess calcium in the blood have to go to get filtered out? The kidneys. This creates a massive, severe risk for developing kidney stones. I want you to imagine being halfway to Mars. You are 3 months away from the nearest hospital or surgical theater, and suddenly an astronaut has to pass a large, jagged kidney stone in zero gravity.
Oh my God, that sounds like a catastrophic, mission-ending medical event.
It very well could be. The pure pain incapacitation alone is a real risk to mission safety. And then beyond the bones, there's the heart. The human heart is just a muscle. On Earth, it works incredibly hard fighting gravity to pull blood up from your toes. In space, it doesn't have to work hard at all. So just like your biceps, if you stop lifting weights, it atrophies. It loses muscle mass, it gets smaller. It actually becomes much more spherical, rounder in shape, because it isn't constantly sagging under the pull of Earth.
A round, tiny heart. That sounds sort of cute, biologically speaking, but I assume it's actually very bad news.
It's perfectly fine while you're floating in space.
Yeah.
But the moment you land on the surface of Mars or splash down back on Earth, gravity returns with a vengeance. You try to stand up out of your seat, the blood immediately rushes down to your feet. But your weakened, atrophied, round little heart simply cannot pump hard enough to push the blood back up to your brain.
Orthostatic intolerance. You faint.
You drop like a literal stone. Your brain loses oxygen and you collapse. That is exactly why when you see the live footage of Soyuz capsule landings on the steps, the cosmonauts are physically dragged out of the hatch and placed into zero-gravity reclining chairs. They physically cannot stand up under their own power without passing out cold.
Man, okay, so they've got the macro stuff, covered the literal explosions, we've got the gross physiology, the fluids rushing to your head and your bones dissolving. But The specific prompt for this deep dive, based on the literature we're reviewing, was to go even deeper, to strip it down to the cellular and molecular level, because that's where the science gets really, really weird, right?
This is the absolute cutting edge of aerospace medicine right now. We're just barely starting to understand this level of detail.
Yeah.
Let's start with a condition known as space anemia.
Space anemia, I've seen headlines about this. Is it just that you end up having less blood in your body?
It's much more active than that. It's driven by a mechanism called hemolysis. For a very long time, doctors just assumed the anemia was a simple fluid balance issue. But a major recent study showed that in the microgravity environment, the human body actively destroys its own red blood cells at a significantly higher rate than it does on Earth.
Why on earth would the body destroy its own oxygen carriers?
The leading theory right now is called neocytolysis. Basically, when all that fluid we talk about rapidly shifts up into your head and chest during your first few days in orbit, your brain gets deeply confused. It senses all this pressure and thinks, whoa, we have way too much blood volume concentrated up here. This is dangerous. So it intentionally triggers a massive biological purge. It starts selectively killing off young red blood cells to thin the blood out and reduce the volume.
So the body is actively trying to help you survive, but it's actually hurting you in the long run.
Exactly. And the really bad news is that the destruction rate stays abnormally high the entire time you are in space. It doesn't just level off quickly. This drastically reduces an astronaut's aerobic capacity. Think about the implications. If you have to do a grueling 8-hour spacewalk to fix a broken solar panel, or if you just landed and need to build a habitat on the surface of Mars, you are doing heavy manual labor with a severely compromised oxygen delivery system in your blood. You are physically measurably weaker.
That is a massive operational handicap. I think the most famous cellular study we have in the literature is the twins study, right, with astronauts Scott and Mark Kelly?
Yes, it provided the ultimate biological control group. You have identical twins with identical DNA. Mark, a former astronaut himself, stays firmly on the ground on Earth. Scott launches and spends nearly a full consecutive year on the ISS. When he came back, NASA scientists compared their biology gene by single gene.
And what did they actually find when they looked that close?
Complete molecular chaos. Let's start by talking about telomeres. These are the little protective molecular cags situated at the very ends of your DNA chromosomes. The easiest way to think of them is like the little plastic tips on the end of your shoelaces that keep them from fraying.
Right. I've read about these in aging studies. As we get older, those plastic tips naturally fray and get shorter and shorter. So short telomeres generally equal old age, right?
Correct. Aging shortens them naturally, but extreme physical or emotional stress usually shortens them even faster. So going into the study, NASA fully expected that when Scott Kelly came back, his telomeres would be incredibly short and ragged from the intense radiation and the physiological stress of spaceflight. But instead, when they checked his blood, his telomeres actually got substantially longer.
Wait, what? Space actually makes you biologically younger?
That was exactly the clickbait headline that every news outlet ran with. Fountain of youth discovered in orbit. But the reality is, it's not true youth. It's a radical survival response. The medical teams concluded that his body was under so much constant systemic attack, from cosmic radiation, from microgravity, from deep inflammation, that his cells basically went into a hyper-defensive overdrive. They were desperately trying to protect the core DNA from shattering, so they lengthened the telomeres as a massive stress response, a defensive shield.
So it's less that he was Benjamin Button getting younger and more that his body was locked in a state of molecular panic.
Complete panic. Because look at what happened next. Within just 48 hours of his capsule returning to Earth, those lengthened telomeres shrank violently. They collapsed and became even shorter than they were before he originally left for space. The body finally relaxed its defenses and just gasped.
That is incredible. And what about his actual genetic code? His genes?
His overall gene expression dramatically changed. Now, we aren't saying his fundamental DNA code mutated into something non-human, but epigenetics, the tiny biological switches that turn specific genes on and off depending on environment, those switches flipped all over the place. The study showed that roughly 7% of Scott Kelly's gene expression did not return to normal immediately after landing. Millions of switches stayed in the new configuration. Genes related to immune system response, critical DNA repair mechanisms, and bone formation networks.
It's almost like his body was actively trying to evolve to the new environment in real time.
Or at the very least, trying frantically to survive a profoundly hostile environment. And it wasn't just the DNA. We also saw severe mitochondrial stress. The mitochondria, the microscopic power plants inside the cells that generate all our energy, They were actively malfunctioning and shedding markers of systemic stress. And perhaps most worryingly, we saw strong evidence of radiodegeneration in the brain structure.
Wait, in the actual physical brain?
Yes. Extensive studies done in mice that were exposed to the exact same types of heavy GCR space radiation show significant, lasting inflammation in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the primary center for memory formation and spatial navigation.
So space radiation makes you lose your memory.
It causes you to lose severe cognitive sharpness. You suffer deficits in recall and problem solving. There is a very provocative finding in the literature that strongly suggests this type of radiation exposure could artificially accelerate the onset of Alzheimer's disease pathology in the brain. I want you to really imagine a crew arriving in orbit around Mars. They've been soaking in a high radiation environment for 6 to 8 solid months. It's time to do the most complex, dangerous landing procedure in human history, and the crew is actively suffering from early onset cognitive decline and memory fog.
That is a genuinely terrifying image. You spend billions of dollars to get there, and when you arrive, you literally can't remember the sequence code to open the airlock to get out.
And just to add one more fascinating layer of biological horror to this whole picture, you aren't alone in your body. Your microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living inside your gut and on your skin, they completely change in space too.
The bacteria get space sick.
No, the bacteria get space strong. In a microgravity environment, bacteria behave completely differently than they do on Earth. We've seen their ability to form biofilms massively increase. They form these incredibly thick, impenetrable, slimy mats on surfaces that are highly resistant to traditional chemical cleaning. They routinely clog the delicate water filtration systems on the ISS.
Okay, that's the equipment, but what happens inside us?
The gene expression of the bacteria changes, and some strains become significantly more virulent. They become more aggressive at causing disease. And simultaneously, they can rapidly become much more resistant to standard antibiotics. So you have an astronaut crew with heavily weakened, stressed immune systems living in a closed tin can with highly mutated superbacteria that are suddenly much harder to kill.
Okay, look, I'm going to be completely honest here. I am sufficiently terrified. We've covered the rockets exploding on the pad, the violent vacuum of space sucking the air from your lungs, the cosmic radiation shotgun shredding your DNA, the squashed eyeballs, the dissolved skeleton, the fading memory, and the superbacteria. Is there literally any good news in these reports? Or should we just pack it in, stay safely on Earth, and watch glossy sci-fi movies about Mars instead?
No, definitely don't lose hope yet.
Yeah.
We are fundamentally problem solvers. That is what human beings do best. And the engineering and medical solutions currently in the pipeline to counter these specific extreme problems are absolutely fascinating.
Okay, let's hear them. Lay some hope on me. Start with the radiation problem, because that seems like the biggest hurdle. If lead walls are a terrible idea that creates shotgun shrapnel, what actually works?
The answer, surprisingly, is hydrogen.
Hydrogen, like the incredibly light gas.
Exactly. Remember the tricycle and the semi-truck analogy. Hydrogen is entirely unique on the periodic table because it has the highest possible charge-to-mass ratio. Its nucleus is essentially just a single proton. It doesn't have a big, dense cluster of heavy neutrons waiting to be shattered into secondary shrapnel. When a massive GCR particle smashes into a field of hydrogen atoms, it's like that speeding semi-truck plowing into a giant pile of fluffy pillows. It safely absorbs and dissipates the extreme kinetic energy without creating any secondary radiation.
So we just need to build hydrogen walls for the ship.
Ideally, yes. And water is a fantastic candidate because it's H2O, 2 parts hydrogen. Deep space habitat concepts heavily rely on something called water walls. Instead of putting heavy metal in the hull, you design the ship so that you pump the crew's entire drinking and wastewater supply into a thick, hollow jacket surrounding the central sleeping quarters. The astronauts literally sleep inside a giant water tank.
That sounds, I don't know, oddly cozy, like sleeping in a room.
It works beautifully. Another highly viable option is polyethylene. Plastic. Standard plastic is incredibly rich in hydrogen bonds. NASA has researched ways to take all the daily plastic trash generated by the crew, compress it, melt it down, and form it into thick plastic bricks. You then line the inside of the radiation storm shelter with your own recycled trash bricks.
That's incredibly resourceful, but plastic isn't nearly strong enough to build an actual spaceship hull out of. You can't just tape a bunch of trash bags together and fly to Mars.
Not on its own, no. But that is exactly where the biggest material science breakthrough comes in. The report highlights a new metamaterial called hydrogenated boron nitride nanotubes, or BNNTs for short.
BNNTs, that is quite a mouthful. Break that chemistry down for me. Why is it so special?
It is essentially a material science triple threat. First, you have the boron element. Boron is scientifically renowned as an amazing absorber of stray neutrons. So if any rogue secondary radiation does somehow get created in the ship, the boron actively eats it up and neutralizes it.
Okay, so the boron acts like the cleanup crew.
Right. Then second, you have the hydrogen atoms permanently interspersed throughout the nanotube lattice to act as the primary kinetic shield against those incoming heavy GCR cannonballs.
And the nanotube part.
That's the structure. Carbon nanotubes are famously incredibly strong. BNNTs are structurally strong enough that you don't just use them as wallpaper inside the ship. You can actually weave them and use them as the primary load-bearing structural material of the spacecraft itself. They are highly heat-resistant, they don't degrade easily, and they are incredibly lightweight.
So you literally build the actual ship out of the shield itself.
Exactly. The hull itself is the protection. You don't need a heavy metal shell and then a separate interior shield. This single material does everything. It is the absolute holy grail for future deep space ship design.
That is incredible engineering, but what about personal wearable protection? Because if I have to go outside the ship to, I don't know, fix a jammed communications antenna, I obviously can't bring a giant water wall out into the vacuum with me.
No, you can't. But you can wear something called the Astrorad vest.
Astrorad. I think I've seen pictures of this online. It looks like a very bulky, futuristic flak jacket, like something SWAT would wear.
It basically is a radiological flak jacket, but it uses a concept called smart shielding. The problem with spacesuits is that you cannot fully protect the entire human body with thick shielding without making the suit way too heavy and rigid for the astronaut to actually bend their arms and do their job. So the Astrorad vest focuses entirely on selective shielding. It only aggressively protects the stem cell-rich areas of the body.
Which are, like, your bone marrow.
Precisely. The thickest parts of the vest specifically cover the dense bone marrow in your hips and spine, your delicate lung tissue, your stomach, and your reproductive organs. The basic medical idea is this. Your arms and your legs can physically absorb a moderate dose of radiation and survive, but you absolutely must protect the biological factories inside your torso that manufacture your white blood cells and your immune system. If you keep the marrow factories safe and unmutated, you prevent the acute radiation sickness cascade that actually kills you.
That is really smart. Just triage the body and prioritize the critical life support systems. So that's the radiation odor. What about all the biological damage we talked about? Can we fix the space anemia or the weird DNA telomeres stretching with, like, a daily pill?
We are actively working on it. Space pharmacology is the absolute next frontier. There is incredibly promising research right now into advanced antioxidants, specifically one called gamma-decotenol, or GT3 for short.
GT3. Sounds like a high-end Porsche sports car. The new 911 GT3.
It's actually a super potent, highly specialized form of vitamin E. Its primary job in the body is to violently scavenge for free radicals. It essentially acts as a chemical sponge to mop up all the toxic chemical mess caused by radiation exposure inside the cells. It's not a magic impenetrable shield, but it acts like a microscopic cellular cleanup crew that follows behind the radiation to mitigate the structural DNA damage.
Okay, chemistry is helping. And what about the lack of gravity? If we can't afford to build those giant spinning ring ships you see in 2001, a space odyssey to create artificial gravity?
We use short-arm centrifuges, localized artificial gravity. You don't need to spin the entire multi-ton spaceship. You just need to build one small dedicated room inside the ship that spins really fast.
Like that carnival ride. The Gravitron, the one that pins you to the wall.
It is exactly like the Gravitron. The medical theory is that if an astronaut spends just 1 or 2 hours a day strapped into a short-arm centrifuge, experiencing intense artificial G-forces, it might be enough to trick the biological systems. The gravity spike tells the bones, hey, we still have gravity down here, keep the calcium matrix strong. It physically forces all that pooled fluid out of the head and back down into the legs. It could entirely prevent the sans-ass eyeball squishing, the moon face, and the round heart atrophy.
It's like a mechanical prescription. Just take 2 spins in the Gravitron and call me in the morning.
Basically, yes, a daily dose of gravity. And finally, before we finish, there is the regulatory aspect we have to briefly touch on. We really need to talk about the impending Wild West of commercial spaceflight.
Right, because historically, NASA astronauts are the elite of the absolute elite. They are Olympic-level physical specimens with multiple PhDs. They have perfect physiology. But if commercial spaceflight takes off and regular people like me buy a ticket to orbit, I might have slightly high blood pressure, I might have a bad knee, I might get migraines.
And that is the massive unknown. We simply do not have any reliable medical data on how average, non-perfect people react to the extreme rigors of spaceflight. What happens when you put a 60-year-old tourist with a minor heart arrhythmia into a centrifuge? Or someone with controlled type 2 diabetes into a fluid shift environment? The FAA is currently scrambling to evaluate safety frameworks for the commercial industry. But as private space travel rapidly expands, the first wave of paying tourists are fundamentally going to be the guinea pigs.
We are the test subjects for the new era.
We are. And whether we want to or not, we're going to learn a tremendous amount about fragile human physiology very, very quickly in the next decade.
So let's wrap this whole deep dive up. We started today by looking at those glossy Mars renderings and asking if the big dream is actually safe.
And the overarching answer is highly complex. Statistically speaking, we have solved the getting there part fairly well. The big rockets generally work. We know the math to launch and land safely. The raw fatality rate is dropping every decade.
But the invisible biological toll.
That is the ultimate new challenge of the 21st century. Surviving the actual journey in one piece. It's no longer just about avoiding the giant fiery explosion on the launch pad. It's about avoiding the slow, agonizing cellular decay in the dark. We have to definitively solve the fluid shifts, the deep radiation damage, and the rapid cognitive decline before we can ever call a Mars colony truly viable.
It really feels like we are stubbornly trying to force a square peg, the fragile human body, which evolved over millions of years specifically for Earth's gravity and magnetic field, into a perfectly round hole, which is the harsh vacuum of the cosmos.
That is the perfect analogy.
Yep.
And it actually brings me to my final thought for this dive, something I really want to leave you and everyone listening to chew on.
What's that?
Look at all the solutions we just talked about. We are designing incredible ships out of BNNTs. We are sewing radiation vests. We are synthesizing antioxidant pills. We are building spinning carnival rides inside spaceships. We are spending billions trying to keep the human body exactly statically as it is on Earth. We basically want to wrap a tiny bubble of Earth around us and drag it millions of miles across the void.
Right, because we desperately want to stay human.
But when you look closely at the molecular changes in someone like Scott Kelly, the telomeres drastically lengthening, the millions of gene expressions shifting, the immune system fundamentally altering MAMs. You don't just see damage, you see the biological machine frantically trying to adapt. You see biology reacting dynamically to a completely new environment.
It's changing.
Exactly. So if we eventually do colonize Mars, if we manage to stay there, survive, and have children there for generations, will those future humans still be biologically human as we currently define it? Or will the extreme environment, the constant background radiation, the one-third gravity, the recycled air, slowly force us to physically evolve?
Will we literally become something else entirely?
Will the true Martians of the future be a completely distinct, divergent species, not because of some sci-fi aliens, but because we fundamentally changed ourselves just to survive the harsh reality of the planet?
Homo specialis.
Exactly. The final question isn't just, are we exploring space? It's, are we going to let space explore and change us?
Man, that is a profound thought that is definitely going to keep me up tonight. Human evolution happening in real time, right in front of our telescopes.
It really is the ultimate biological experiment.
Well, on that massive existential bombshell, we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for walking us through the terrifying nightmare and the incredible dream of leaving this planet.
Always a pleasure to be here.
And to all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us once again on the deep dive. Keep looking up at the stars, but maybe take a second to really appreciate the comfortable gravity holding you safely down in your chair today. We'll see you next time.